Welcome to Lesson 7, Attacking Leaks in Your Opponent's Game Plan. Here are some of the topics covered today. We're going to be discussing common imbalances and leaks for fishes and wrecks. Next, we're going to be discussing some appropriate responses versus different strategies. Lastly, we're going to be using statistics to help us make better decisions and adjustments against our opponents. So first of all, let's talk about the loose passive fish, the fish that we tend to make the most from. Let's try to understand his mindset. So the loose passive fish basically wants to see as many flops as possible with a relatively small investment. So generally he will adopt a high limping frequency, and some of them might play fit or fall post flop. Why is that the case? It's because when you are playing with such a wide range of hands with trashy hands like 7-4 off, it's just going to be really hard to connect with the flop very often when your range is that wide. Of course, there are some station fishes and versus station fishes who are both extremely loose pre and post. You probably want to not get too out of line. They also avoid putting in too much money without strong holdings. So the general mindset is that when they are bluffing, they want to wait for you to show weakness, then they want to bluff with a small bet size. They want to bluff as cheaply as possible. Yeah, so they prefer to adopt a wait and see approach. A more aggressive player might call the flop and then bet the turn immediately, whereas the loose passive fish will tend to prefer taking the free card and wait until the river before bluffing. They also tend to view flop and turn checks as a sign of weakness. I guess generally checking at some point is a sign of weakness, but like when certain players check on like ace high bots which are nice to bluff at, it's pretty obvious that they have a medium strength mate hand. But a fish is not thinking about bot textures and ranges. A fish's mind is just a lot simpler. So when you check, you are weak, so I bluff. So that's basically how a fish thinks, right? The fish will stab a lot when checked too. And after you check the flop, let's say you have position, you check back the flop against the fish. In the fish's mind, you are very unlikely to be strong, and he will probably be willing to call turn and river with like third pair or second pair. So why is that the case? It's that way because the fish is projecting the way he thinks onto you. And when you recall what I said earlier about the fish's mindset is that he wants to bluff as cheaply as possible, and he prefers a wait and see approach. So fishes like to check back the flop, wait for weakness, and then pounce on it after that. So they might think you are doing a delay to barrel with some air hands. So that's generally the case. They also love trapping with strong holdings, because what you'll find is that fishes who are extremely loose pre-flop rarely get to make a strong hand. And from their experience, whenever they make a big bet or raise, their opponents will fold pretty often. So a lot of the time they remember such things, and their adjustment in the future is just to slow play a lot more. Try to bait you, lure you in, and prefer waiting until a later street before raising. So here are some of the common imbalances for loose passive fish. The bet check bet line. So because the fish likes to adopt the wait and see approach, the bet check bet line is often going to have more bluffs than it should have. So he bets the flop as a bluff, but the turn goes check check. He thinks you are weak, so he tries to bluff the river again. Small donk bet over multiple streets. So if the fish is the pre-flop caller, he might just keep probe betting like maybe 1/3 pot 3 times. He might do that with a range of hands including like top pair, middle pair, bottom pair, or even some air hands. I've seen plenty of these type of things. Turn and river raises are almost always going to be the nuts, like 80 to 90% of the time or more. When a fish raises the turn on the river, he has 2 pairs or better. So if you have one pair, you should fold. If you have bottom two pair, consider folding. If you have top two, hope he has some sort of weaker two pair, or he's just bluffing. The good thing about having top two is that you block a lot of his set combinations, which is great. Check, flop, raise, turn. It might be a freezer play when your opponent takes this line, but sometimes it's usually strong, I think. Min, dong bet, and then 3-bet flop. It's a variant of the check raise, because if a min bet is treated as a check, then this is as good as a check raise, right? But I think this line is like almost 95% the nuts. It's a lot stronger than the flop check raise, I would say, based on my own experience. The min dong bet 3-bet flop is just stronger than a flop check raise. A fish could still have a wide range on a flop when he check raises, because fishes sometimes have this type of testing. They want to test your hand, so they have this sort of mindset. They want to see where they are at in the hand, so they raise for information. What are some exploits against a loose passive player? So I would first of all fold against late street aggression if the pot gets too big. So if the opponent fires the flop, turn, and a river, and he uses a very large bet size, I would strongly consider folding like a top pair, decent kicker type of hand, because the fish is just not 3-barreling a lot as a bluff. So remember, the fish is unwilling to take huge risks with air hands, because that's just how he thinks and approaches the game. Secondly, if I had like top pair, weak kicker, or middle pair, I will almost always just check the flop. I think that the reason is twofold. Firstly, the fish might just bluff way too much on the turn and the river. Secondly, he will just call down too light after you check. So if the fish double checks, you know that your top pair weak kicker goes up a lot in relative hand strength, because it's very likely he has top pair himself. So you can actually just use larger bet sizes on the turn and river. So this allows you to squeeze a lot of thin value from the fish. I wouldn't mind bluffing a lot on earlier streets with c-bets, especially on the drier board textures, because the fish is just too loose and it's very hard for him to connect. Of course, after getting called, I would tend to avoid barreling too much, unless there is a scare card, or unless I picked up some equity. Moving on to the second player type, mindset of a weak type player. So the mindset of a weak type player is that he just wants to fold and wait for the next hand. So in his mind, he will just get you next time. He will just hope to pick up something and be able to call you down. But generally, when he has something not too strong, he will just always think of the worst. He's timid. He's afraid of losing money, calling down against huge bets, because when he did that in the past, he probably ran into the nuts and then he got traumatized by that somehow. So the weak type player will always convince himself to make folds, weak folds. When he's not sure what you're up to, he will fold. He's also afraid of losing money running huge bluffs, so be afraid when he shows strength, but when he's weak, you should just pounce on him. What are some common imbalances of weak type players? So their turn and river raises also tend to be really strong, like the loose passive player. Their triple barrels also tend to be really strong, like the loose passive player. Overbets tend to be strong as well, like the loose passive player. So these two categories of players tend to bluff way too little when they are showing a huge sign of strength. And lastly, they tend to have static defending ranges. They don't really know how to adjust their ranges based on different bet sizes. Yeah, so the exploit versus this sort of player is very simple. We just fold whenever that weak type player starts to show any sign of strength. When he shows weakness, we want to turn up the level of aggression, overbet, triple barrel, whatever it is, to push him off his hand. Even raising the turn, he will convince himself you have 2 pair or better. So I'll start raising turns and rivers a lot lighter, especially when he opts for a smaller bet size. Since his defending ranges are static, I want to be bluffing smaller, and I want to be value betting larger, right? So I guess we want to be over betting as a bluff against a weak side player. I guess on the earlier streets, if he's just calling with top pair or middle pair or bottom pair or a draw, we just want to bet 1/3 pot without air. When we have an extra hand, just bet larger to maximize our value. But on later streets like the river, I don't think he's necessarily static in his defending range. So we bet a normal bet size when we have a strong hand. When we bet small, it's to induce a light call. With our value hands, when we want to bluff, we should just overbet to push him off his hand. So I guess it's the opposite on the river, when his range is elastic against different bet sizes. But on the flop, I'm mostly referring to the flop. So we want to just bluff small and value bet large. We have the third class of players here. We want to understand the mindset of the mediocre aggressive player now. So what the mediocre aggro player likes to do is just to pounce on any signs of weaknesses without really giving much thought into his own perceived range. He doesn't have a well thought out game plan, and he usually fast plays most of his decent hands. So basically he has not enough strong hands when he takes a more passive line, and we can actually abuse that. What are some of the common imbalances for such a player? He steps too often when check 2, especially on the flop on a wetter texture. He doesn't really have a turn check raising range on a turn as the pre-flop raiser. So bet flop check raise turn, that's just a very unlikely line for him to take. When he takes the bet check bet line, he's rarely bluffing because it's the best way to extract value from a fish, right? So he uses this as a value line very often, but he doesn't think of how to balance his ranges here, and thus he is just too weighted towards bluffs. He tends to bet once and just give up, or if he had any sort of bluff that he wanted to continue wrapping, he would probably bet instead. Bet flop, bet turn. Check bet line also has way too few bluffs, because if he wanted to bluff, he would either bluff the flop or the turn. He is very unwilling to wait until the river to bluff. Low check raise frequency on dry boards. So when someone rarely check raises something on a dry board, what you find is that when they do check raise, they are probably bluffing because they probably just slow play or the monster hands. Lastly, they don't slow play enough. I guess against the majority of opponents, it doesn't really make sense to check back a set on the flop, or maybe an overpair. But yeah, so a mediocre aggressive player will almost never slow play in position. And when we are talking about out of position, the mediocre aggressive player might take some weak top pair hands to check the flop, but he probably doesn't check OOP with overpairs or like top pair top kicker type of hands. Like maybe ace king on an a7 deuce board. They just don't do it enough, so you can just abuse them. Here are some exploits for the mediocre aggressive player. First of all, I'll bring them out of their comfort zones with overbets and underbets. They just won't know how to deal with them properly. Block bets are really nice for inducing against the mediocre aggro tart. He just spazzes whenever you bet small. Checking out of position as the pre-flop raiser on a wet texture is going to be really nice, because he just probably steps like 70% of the time. If let's say you call the flop bet and then he goes for the bet check bet line, you probably don't want to pay him off too light with second pair a lot of the time. You can turn your hand into a check raise bluff against either the bet check bet or the check check bet line. I would give less credit to the flop check raise as mentioned earlier. I will be willing to float, especially if his check raise size is on the smaller side and I have some sort of backdoor draws. 3 betting on a dry board, I guess people don't really believe you when you do that, so hard to say whether you should do it. And when your opponent checks back on the flop, you can just overbet turn, overbet river, just punish him. So when we are facing weird situations and when you are in doubt on how to play, I guess this is a pretty obvious thing to say, but I'll just say it anyway. When the opponent has shown signs of being spazzy, crazy, aggressive, just call whenever he's doing some weird line. When he is a straightforward, weak tight player and he does like an overbet or just some funny, funky line, bet flop, check turn, overbet river, this type of thing, I'll probably lean towards folding. So let's go through a few examples. Button raises to 2 big blinds. The big blind 3 bets to 8 big blinds with ace 10. The button calls. The big blind c bets the flop. The turn gets checked around. The big blind goes for a bet on a river. And the big blind just jams it here. So it's a spot where the button cannot really represent anything. I think pocket deuces has to fold the flop. So he's either wrapping ace deuce. I guess ace deuce is kind of the nuts because people tend to bet ace 6 and ace 9 and ace king on the turn and go for 3 streets. Or he's wrapping a slow played flush, I suppose. But what bluffs can he have here? Would he turn like 9-8 into a bluff? I feel like that's really unlikely. So when people can't wrap much and they are weak tight, they probably aren't bluffing in my opinion. It's just a really rare spot for most players to bluff. I think a world-class player would be balanced here if he raises the river. He'll probably occasionally just turn like a mid-pan to a bluff. Spazzy players may randomly just bluff here. Although, again, this is not the best spot to bluff, but in general I would make a fold here. Example 2. So the big blind 3 bets with jack 9 of spades. The button calls. The big blind bets the flop. He checks on a queen turn. The river, on a river he checks again. The button suddenly goes for a 2x bet. So what should the big blind do again? So once again, this is a spot very dependent on the opponent. So I feel like in this spot people may show up with more bluffs compared to before. Because in this spot, the big blind checked twice. So he is perceived to be weaker. In the first example, the big blind bet the river. So he's showing signs of strength. So I guess people will be more inclined to bluff here, but still it's kind of a similar spot. Think of your opponent's general mindset and default mode and follow your heart, I suppose. Against a weak tight player, he's probably never bluffing. Against a passive player, he's probably never bluffing. Against a spazzy aggro player, he may or may not be bluffing, so that depends. Okay, so lastly, let's talk about statistics. I think that the majority of winning players, they can't really be clearly classified into one of these categories. I guess at the lower limits you might run into many mediocre aggressive players, but let's say at the mid-stakes, most of the winning players are really strong. So you can't really deal with them like that in such a straightforward manner. So you just need to look at two very useful stats to guess their default modes. So one, when soft flop and when to showdown are two really nice stats to look at. WWSF. This stat represents how often someone tries to fight for the flop. So if someone is very aggressive and keeps trying to fight for the flop, you'll find that his WWSF is going to be a lot higher. A good player probably has this stat at about 50%. A passive player is going to have his stat like below 44%, 43% or below. So when someone has a WWSF of 40%, and he does a strange aggressive line, like he suddenly raises the river in a random spot, I am going to fold. So this stat is best used when bluff catching in unique situations. When the guy has a when the guy has a WWSF of 53%, you don't really have a good sample on the other stats. Just default to calling lighter. When the guy has a low WWSF, just make weak tight folds. Pretty simple, right? When to showdown, a fish, loose station fish, tends to have when to showdown of like 33-35% or more. A nit will have it at like 24% or below. Anything in between is like what various regulars could have. A top class regular would have it like 28-32%, I think. A standard tech player at lower limits might have it like 25-26%. So figure out your opponent's default mode when trying to bluff in unusual situations. If you take a strange line, use strange bet sizes. If he's a station, he will just default to calling. If he's a nit with a low WTSD, he's going to default to folding. Auto profit frequencies. So I think it's important just to look at the relevant stats. Figure out how much someone is deviating from optimality, and then you just adjust your default bluffing, value betting, bluff raising, and bluff catching range based on your opponent's game plan accordingly. So let's look at a bunch of relevant stats. Red represents tight ranges. Yellow represents normal ranges, and green represents the loose range. So when someone folds 50% against in the big blind against a small blind steal, he's way too tight. I'll just steal close to 100%. When someone folds 40%, I might just steal 65%. I can do a slight exploit. It's a bit too tight. When someone folds 30%, he's probably defending optimal. So maybe I steal about 50% from the small blind. When someone is folding versus a 3-bet of 65%, he's too tight. I'm going to I could use slightly more 3-bet bluffs than value 3-bet hands. So I can deviate from the 1-to-1 ratio. Just add slightly more bluffs, maybe 1 to 1.5 value to bluff. Secondly, when I pick a 3-bet bluff, I'm going to be using a polarized 3-bet range. I'm not going to be 3-betting ace-x suited or 10-9 suited so much. I'm going to be using a slightly weaker group of hands. If someone is folding only 50%, he is pretty optimal. So I'll stick with the 1-to-1 ratio, or maybe use slightly more value hands. I'll also pick just slightly stronger 3-bet bluffing hands sometimes. Against someone who folds 40% or less, let's say someone only folds 25%. So it's pretty loose, right? I might want to just use a linear range. 3-bet king queen off, ace jack off for value if he's wide enough. I also want to avoid using very weak hands like 7-3 suited. Instead, I'll pick hands like 10-9 suited, ace-5 suited. 4 versus 4-bet. 55 is too much. 45 seems kind of right. 35 is someone who's defending a lot. Pretty common at higher stakes. So, against someone folding 55%, I'll use a polarized 4-betting range. My 4-bet bluffs will comprise blockers with high cuts, either an ace or like a hand like king jack off. When someone's folding 35%, I want to pick hands like jack 8 suited as my bluffs. And if someone doesn't really know how to adjust properly, he folds 30% or less, maybe you can just not 4-bet bluff at all. Although a better player will probably notice it. 4 versus 5-bet, 60% is too much, 50% is normal, 40% is too little. If someone folds too much against 5-bets, just 3-bet and 5-bet a lot more. Expand your value range. If someone's not folding as much, just so for example, when someone is folding too little, maybe your default range is jacks plus and ace king, you might want to add pocket tens, expand your value range. If someone is folding a lot against 5 bets. I might want to call a 4 bet with pocket 10s, but instead I could use like pocket 5s or like king 9 suited to 5 bet bluff with something weaker. Of course, shoving pocket the 10s, there's also going to be plus EV, but this is how I might adjust. Still small blind, 50 is normal, above 60 is pretty loose, below 40 is really tight. 3 bet multiplier. So just look at your opponent's opening range. Look at your opening range, look at his 3 bet range, and figure out his multiplier. So if I'm opening 40% from the button and my opponent is only 3 betting me 10%, then his 3 bet multiplier is 0.25. And in that case, I think he's too tight. If he's 3 betting me like 16% against my 40% opening range, then his multiplier is 0.4, and I think he's 3 betting too wide. So this is dependent on the situation. I don't say like 10% is wide or 5% is wide. It really depends on both players' starting positions and starting ranges. Same goes for 4 bet multiplier. 0.45 is normal, 0.35 is tight, 0.55 is and above is really aggressive. So against someone aggressive, I just want to 5 bet wider. Against someone tighter, I want to fold more when I 3 bet and I face a 4 bet. So for example, maybe I am only 3 betting 4% against the under the gun open. So if someone is only 4 betting me with like 1 to 2%, he might be using like a 0.35 multiplier. So it's really tight. I want to make a lot of weak tight folds against this guy. Post flop. So if your opponent folds 60% or more against a flop raise, I'm going to be bluff raising the flop very light. And yeah, I would probably be more inclined to slow play my strong hands. Let him barrel the turn before raising. If someone's folding less than 40%, just weight your range towards strong hands, strong draws, and you could even put in some thin value raises with top pairs sometimes. Fold versus flop, c-bet. 50, 45, 40. I think 45 is kind of standard. Against someone folding 50%, he's probably folding too much. I'm going to use a really small size to c-bet. Against someone folding very little, maybe he is elastic against different bet sizes. So I may want to size my bets larger. Not necessarily the case, but something to think about. Fold versus turn c-bet, 45, 40, 35. People tend to fold less on the turn based on my experience at higher stakes. Although I did ask some of my students whether they had a higher fold versus turn or fold versus flop c-bet. And many of them did fold more on the turn. So that was kind of strange. But they probably were defending way too tight on the turn, folding most middle pairs, which kind of explains the overly tight strat. But basically, from my experience playing at the mid stakes, I think what I wrote here is kind of reasonable. Fold versus river bet, 55, 50, 45. Why do we fold more on the river? This is because on the turn we have main hands and draws. On the river we always have to fold our draw, right, when facing a bet. So on the turn, the defender's range contains pairs and draws. A lot of his range has good equity to improve on the river. The aggressor is also usually barreling with equity and not pure air. So when you compare the turn to the flop, on the flop we have a lot of like very weak pure air hands. So our range there is slightly more inelastic towards different bet sizes. But on the turn now, the defender's range is more bet size elastic. So I think people tend to fold less on the turn. And that seems to be right. On the river, people have busted draws with no showdown value. So the folding frequency is higher as mentioned earlier. And a few more stats here. C-bet turn or river. I think 50% is standard. Anything 60% or higher is too much. Anything 40% or less is too little. So if someone is too passive, you just fold more. If someone is too aggressive, you call down lighter. Bet flop check turn bet river line. This is a stat I have not used very often until like 2014, whereby I added it into my HUD at the end of the year. And I really like this stat. I think 25% is kind of average. When someone takes the bet check bet line 20% or less, he has way too many value hands. When he takes it 30% or more, he's going to show up with many bluffs. So be prepared to call against the bet check bet line with like second pair. Raise flop, I think 12 is kind of standard, 18 is a bit high, 6 and below means he's a really nitty player. When someone's really nitty, just give it to him when you have like middle pair or bottom pair. I guess with top pair you might have to call once. Against an 18% range, you want to be 3-bet bluffing sometimes. You want to stack off light with overpairs or top pair strong kickers, even in single raise pots sometimes. Because someone raising 18% will often have like thin value check raisers with top pair middle kicker. Yeah, so all these are really useful stats to have. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this lesson. Do the homework, have a look at the answers, and let me know if you have any more questions. I'll be happy to answer any of them. So see you guys in the next lesson, lesson 8, where we are going to be talking about how to plan our bets for future street planning. Okay, so see you and have a nice day.